Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So today is the centenary of the burning of some of Cork City by some of the auxiliaries of the Royal Irish Constabulary and indeed units of the British Army. So 11th of December 1920 this occurred, exactly 100 years ago today. So I'm first of all going to praise him what happened and look at the consequences of it. So there was a conflict going in Ireland since January 1919. The IRA, Irish Republican Army, was this insurgent force trying to split Ireland away from the United Kingdom and set up Ireland as a republic. And the Royal Irish Constabulary was the police, the RIC, but quite a few of the RIC had been killed, had been invalidated out. There was a natural attrition, RIC officers dying of natural causes or retiring, but not enough Irishmen were volunteering to join the RIC. So the RIC had to fill the gaps by getting people from Great Britain to join. And then the auxiliaries in particular, and the auxiliaries were men from Great Britain who joined the RIC who had a solely counterinsurgent role, because the RIC had been doing policing of all kinds, from searching for lost children to dealing with pickpockets, but also some role in upholding the state, as every police force does, is there to stop people trying to use force to overthrow the state. With the auxiliaries, they were not dealing with ordinary crime. They were only there to fight the IRA, going around in large units. So they were auxiliary, as in helping the ordinary RIC. So the auxiliaries had only arrived in Ireland in July 1920. Anyway, so Collins Barracks in Cork was then known as Victoria Barracks, up on a hill, sort of Patrick's Hill, just north of the city centre. Anyway, and every evening the army would come out and march into the centre of Cork City and just really be dominating the city centre. There was a curfew as well. I think it was part of enforcing the curfew, which is why they were doing it. But the auxiliaries had made the mistake of establishing a pattern. So the IRA knew that the auxiliaries will be going on the same route in the same direction at the same time and in roughly the same numbers every night. So the IRA staged an audacious attack, a grenade attack on an auxiliary lorry. Only killed one member of the auxiliaries, but wounded a dozen, and that's Dillon's Cross, only half a mile from Victoria Barracks, as it was called at the time. So the IRA had to scarper out of there. Well, the auxiliaries were not happy about their comrade being killed, and so they and some soldiers, they came down into the city centre shortly afterwards, and they started burning buildings. Now, some observers say it seemed to be very well planned. They were knowing exactly what they're going for, so it's speculated that they had planned this beforehand. And had they planned it some days beforehand in case they were provoked in any way, or what? Maybe it wasn't planned. Perhaps it was spontaneous. We're just not sure. But it was dozens, if not hundreds, of members of the auxiliaries and the army who were doing this, which would make one think: were they ordered to do so? Were there officers among them? I'm not sure, but certainly that the senior army officers don't seem to have done anything to countermand this. So Patrick Street is the main drag in Cork. So that's the centre of commercial life in Cork, and indeed the whole of Munster. That's Ireland's southern province, Cork being the third biggest city in Ireland. So a lot of very valuable commercial property was burnt, and the city hall was burnt, which is just south of the river. The Carnegie Library was also torched. The fire brigade were called, tried to douse the flames. Sometimes they were threatened to get back by members of the RIC or indeed the army, and it's said that hoses were pierced with bayonets so they couldn't contain the conflagration. So trying to burn particular buildings, and there's one shop that the Crown forces were about to burn. They're persuaded that it was a unionist who owned it, so they decided not to. So it burnt most of Patrick Street. It spread to some of the adjacent streets, such as Winthrop Street. And people often talk about the burning of Cork City, which is a misnomer. Obviously, they didn't burn the whole of the city. They burnt a fairly small section, but it was the most valuable part of the city at all. So about £3 million in damage was done at the time, which is far, far more in modern terms. It's something like 200 million euros worth of damage. The buildings themselves and the stock that was contained in these buildings. They're mostly shops, some residences as well. So a lot of people made homeless. Some of the shop assistants used to live in flats over these main shops. about 2,000 people were put out of work, which was huge, considering the population of Cork City was under 100,000 at the time. Some of those are children, some of those are pensioners, some of those are housewives. Those who are actually working are perhaps 50,000. There was already some unemployment because of the economic dislocation occasioned by the First World War, which ended only 2 years earlier. So anyway, then the auxiliaries, they managed to track 2 IRA men to a house several miles from Dillon Cross where the ambush had taken place. It's speculated that one of them dropped his hat because everybody used to wear hats in the 1920s, and a bloodhound followed the scent, or were they tipped off by an informer? So they went to the house some hours after the attack, and they got these 2 guys, and they got them to confirm their names. They were then shot dead on the spot. We're not absolutely sure that it is the auxiliaries who did that. Likely it is. Auxiliaries could have been the army, could have been other the so-called anti-Sinn Féin society, if there was one, just loyalist activists, people killing them for some other reason. A personal grudge? Was it a faction fight in the IRA? I mean, obviously, the IRA turned on itself from June 1922. That's the Irish Civil War. So the idea that the IRA killed each other during this conflict occasionally is not as far-fetched as some people like to pretend. But yeah, the most plausible explanation is it was members of the Crown Forces. Now, it was illegal to kill them. These guys were obviously foolish to tell their true names. If they'd created some doubt about their identity, perhaps they wouldn't have been killed. Obviously, it was not only illegal, unethical, also foolish to kill them if it was the Crown Forces who did that. Arrest them. They could be a mine of information. And the Crown Forces had over 20,000 IRA prisoners detained in various prisons interned at Ballykinlar, County Down. Moreover, they could have been charged with various offences, court-martial, sentenced to death, as occasionally happened. Only 24 IRA men were executed by the Crown Forces in this 1919 to 21 period. Now, the story is that I have that they were shot unarmed and they weren't trying to escape or anything. Now, I've not heard a Crown Forces account of it, if indeed it was members of the auxiliaries or indeed the British Army who killed them. It could have been they tried to make a run for it, or they tried to grab our guns or something like that. Or in the dark, we were not sure what they were doing. Anyway, otherwise it would have been murder if the Crown Forces deliberately killed these guys who were not posing any threat to them when they could very easily have arrested them. So just foolish apart from anything else in the Crown Forces, if you're just putting morality aside. So why did the auxiliaries, K Company in particular, and I think some soldiers, burn down this most precious property in the middle of Cork City? Well, partly fury, vengeance, they're angry about their comrade being killed. Was it also deterrence? If there are any more attacks in the Crown Forces, we'll burn down even more of the city. So they thought that most people living in the city were IRA sympathisers, and indeed there was some logic to that. So a lot of Corkonians were pro-IRA, I suppose some neutral, not many were in favour of the Crown Forces, and those who had been wavering were more likely to be tipping towards the IRA. Some of them who'd been unionists might be put off by what had been done, because the RIC, the Auxiliary Division, are supposed to be police officers, supposed to be providing security for life and property, not destroying private property. And people who are not in any way involved in the IRA were having their property destroyed. So it seemed to be collective punishment for the city. So they were counterinsurgents, these forces, but they seemed to be taking it out on the general population. It was going to affect everybody. How would I feel if I'd been alive at the time? If my shop, my business, my home had been burned or whatever, I'd lost my job because my workplace had been reduced to cinders. Well, I would have been irate, depressed, full of odium, that kind of thing. So it wasn't going to help them. But it might have heightened belligerence. But people are only so bellicose. After a while, that dies down, and people just want peace. There's not that much fighting spirit. So if they'd actually just targeted the IRA, that would have been one thing. But in this irregular conflict, the IRA obviously made themselves difficult to find by going outside the Geneva Convention and not wearing uniforms, by blending in the civilian population, trying to use civilians as human shields, as guerrillas usually do. But by the standard at the time, obviously the behaviour of the Crown Forces was mild. Might seem a surprising thing to say. You think of some of the irregular conflicts which were going on at the time, or say the behaviour of the German army in Belgium when they said they were franc-tireurs, rounding up hundreds of civilians and shooting them dead if there'd ever been any sniping incident. Sometimes there wasn't even a sniping incident. It was a blue-on-blue incident within the German army, or the conduct of, say, in the Rif Wars in Morocco, where the French and Spanish were fighting, or how the Ottoman Empire had dealt with rebellions, or trying to annihilate the Armenian civilian population, or the Russian Civil War was going on at the time, or the Mexican Civil War was going on at the time, or even the Spartacus revolts in Germany, attempted communist revolutions in Germany, the Russian Civil War, the various irregular conflicts that were in progress at the time, how it was dealt with when there were huge scale massacres of civilians. So really, the Crown forces come out as better than anyone else, which is not to say their conduct was perfect or even good, sometimes bad, occasionally appalling. Anyway, so the effect, well, what was it? So morality aside, did it work from the Crown forces' perspective, as in to scare the IRA off committing these attacks? We better not. Otherwise, the Crown forces will burn down more of Cork. Or civilians who say, well, I'm going to therefore work against the IRA, try and dissuade them from launching more attacks, since otherwise the Crown will take it out on the general public. Or indeed, if I happen to know anything about attack, I'm going to inform the Crown forces, tip them off. Obviously, you do so at the risk of your life. If you're found to be telling the Crown forces anything useful, you're going to be killed by the IRA. And indeed, the IRA killed 73 civilians at least in Cork in this January 1919 to July 1921 period. Most people they claim to be informers. The true figure has been claimed to be much higher. People have said up to 200, but certainly 73 who are proven. And about 66 civilians killed by the Crown forces. Why? I have to go into each case. Did they believe this person to be in the IRA? Did they think the person was armed, or was it failing to halt? You can see why obviously the Crown forces were jumping. They were trigger happy, because when there was an engagement, whoever opened fire first won. But obviously, if members of the Crown forces purposefully killed a civilian, not believing him or her to be a threat, then that would be murder. And there are some cases like that, like Canon Magna and a young man called Crowley killed outside Dunmanway. But this wasn't even successful from the Crown forces' point of view, because there were a few small-scale attacks just outside Cork City between then and July 1921. That was the truce, 11th of July. I always thought it was curious. It was the day before what Orangemen called the Glorious 12th. Might have made it for a tense marching season. But only 4 weeks after the burning of Cork City, there was a large-scale attack right in the heart of the city, 4th of January 1921, when there was an RIC barracks, as we used to call it, not station, just south of Parnell Bridge, near the then burnt-out City Hall. And the city corporation, as in council, had stopped providing gas lighting for the streets as part of some sort of row with the Crown forces. But in the dark, the IRA were able to hide in, I think it was a derelict building. And the RIC, and I think it was the ordinary RIC, not the auxiliaries, had again been very unwise. They hadn't learnt their lesson, and they'd established a pattern. So the IRA knew these guys were going to be going over the same bridge at the same time, in the same direction, and roughly the same numbers. So it allowed the IRA to prepare, to lie in wait at a particular time. The IRA didn't want to get there too early. The longer they're there, the greater the chance of discovery, and obviously didn't want to get there too late to carry out their attack. So the Royal Irish Constabulary walked into the ambuscade, and then the IRA opened fire, including, I think it was with the Lewis gun. So there were, I believe it's 10 RIC officers, 8 of whom were wounded and 2 of whom were killed. Perhaps a surprisingly small killed number. And the IRA, I don't think any of them were wounded. So it actually hadn't put the IRA off, and there were no more burnings. But now the Army and the RIC, about the burning of Cork City on the 11th of December, were asked, so what happened? And they said that the IRA had started it and things like that, or the fire had started in the middle of Cork, because the centre of Cork is an island, and had spread across the River Lee, had jumped the channel. So Sir Hamer Greenwood, who was the Secretary of State for Ireland in the House of Commons, he announced that he supported this version of events, which was a falsehood. And indeed, there's at least one letter by a member of the Auxiliary Division, Royal Irish Constabulary, home saying, yeah, we did it all right. and allegedly some of the auxiliaries, when they posted some other town, wearing half-burnt corks in their hats, which was supposed to be a drollery, an allusion to the torching of Patrick Street, because it's in Cork. I don't know if that's true, but obviously these stories gets around, and it's so that they wore them, that all the auxiliaries wore them. So K Company was pretty soon sacked for that, but 2 Mile, they should have been prosecuted for it. So I'm not sure that that reprisals, as in burning buildings, were ever official. After this, sometimes it was authorized, but could it be effective counterinsurgent strategy? I suppose it could be. Is it immoral? Most people would say it is. Now, if you burnt the house of someone who really had been helping the IRA, that's different on the basis that your house is not a house; it's a enemy barracks or whatever, or the commissariat, the intelligence department of the enemy. And in these counterinsurgent conflicts in many other countries, if you help the insurgents in any way, you didn't lose your house, you lost your life. They'd be shot dead. But that didn't happen. So it was driving a wedge between the general public and the Crown forces. When the fire broke out on the 11th of December, that evening, it carried on well into the 12th of December the next day, and the fire brigade was summoned from Limerick and as far as way to Dublin to assist to finally put out the flames. And I think, unfortunately, it was actually quite a dry evening. It was unseasonably mild. If it had been raining heavily, then that would have put out the fires precipitously. So compensation was paid in 1938, and a new city hall was erected on the ruins of the old one. So there were 7 more months of conflict. And then the IRA put out peace feelers in December 1920. Was it partly because of this? And the Crown forces concluded that maybe the IRA was on its last legs, so to actually intensify the conflict. But perhaps not. But that's partly to do with this young man called Conor Clune being shot dead in Dublin on Bloody Sunday about a fortnight earlier, November 1920. Won't go into all the events that day, but several RIC officers, some undercover Crown Forces agents posing as civilians, were shot dead by the IRA. But the auxiliary division of the RIC were going around interviewing various suspects. They went into some hotel. There was a young man called Conor Clune, and he made some unwise remarks such as, "I'm willing to die for Ireland," a noble sentiment, I know. But at the height of this conflict, the auxiliaries took this as some sort of threat to them. You're saying you're in the IRA then, are you? I mean, if the IRA had met an English civilian at the time and said, "I'm willing to die for England," they'd think, "What, you're telling us you're a spy or something?" But anyway, he was killed by the auxiliaries, and he was not armed, I don't think, or trying to grab their gun or run away. So that was murder. His uncle happened to be the Archbishop of Perth, Australia, heard about this, said, "I want to stop this bloodshed," intervened. There were obviously Catholic priests in every town, and the clergy, they were speaking to the IRA. Could we act as an intermediary to arrange a parley between His Majesty's government and the IRA? But actually that came to naught. Not until July 1921 was a truce arranged. So the conflict in Ireland, people often exaggerate obviously the death toll. So it's about 0.7% of people were killed of the Irish population between January 1919 and July 1921. Obviously it's a lot, rather than nobody was killed, but we mustn't exaggerate that the scale of mortality. You look at, say, Serbia, was something like 20% of the entire population was killed in the First World War, 20% of all the belligerent countries in the First World War. All of them, save Japan, had suffered a higher death toll than we'd experienced in Ireland. Admittedly, this Irish conflict was only 2.5 years at that stage. The First World War was over 4 years. So that's it, a tristful event, and members of the Crown Forces disgraced themselves. Obviously not forgotten in Ireland. So almost the whole of Patrick Street dates from after 1920. Took a few years to rebuild the whole place. Illegal, unacceptable to lash out and try and punish the whole population, really turning people against them. And as it happened, not even an effective counterinsurgent tactic. So that's all from me. Toodaloo.